There are two things that built my life: concrete and rules. The concrete is under my steel-toed boots right now, a freshly poured foundation for a 3-story historical restoration in Low-High. The air smells of ozone from a welder's torch and the clean bite of cut pine. My rule number one, the one I forged when I was 18 with $200 and a one-way bus ticket out of Pennsylvania, is simple. Never owe anyone anything. Ever. It's a rule that has served me well. It's the foundation upon which I built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. My crew knows my other rules. Show up on time. Do it right the first time. No excuses. They respect the rules because I live by them harder than anyone. I'm the first on site and the last to leave. Today, I'm walking the second-floor joists, my hard hat snug, pointing out a subtle warp in a reclaimed timber beam to my foreman, Dave. I want it replaced, Dave. Not sanded, not hidden. Replaced. The client is paying for perfection, not good enough. He just nods. He knows the drill. In my world, there are no gray areas. There is only the blueprint and the execution. There is only strong and weak. It's the vibration in my pocket that breaks the rhythm. I ignore it. It's probably a supplier. But then it comes again. Insistent. I pull out my phone, ready to bark at whoever thinks their call is more important than my structural integrity review. But the screen shows a number I don't recognize. An area code from 15 years ago. A ghost. A cold finger traces its way down my spine. Why would I even answer? It's a violation of at least a dozen of my unwritten personal bylaws. But my thumb moves on its own, a traitor swiping across the screen. I bring the phone to my ear. This is Maya. For a few seconds, there's only static, like the sound of a vast distance. Then a voice, thin and brittle, like old paper. Maya? It's Mom. 5 years. It has been almost 5 years since I last heard that voice. On that occasion, it was a stilted birthday message left on my voicemail that I never returned. Before that, another 6 years of near silence. Her voice is different now, stripped of the weary disappointment that I remembered. Now it's just hollowed out. Mom, I say, and the name feels foreign in my mouth, like a word from a language I no longer speak. Dave is watching me, his expression curious. I turn away, facing the Denver skyline. I know I shouldn't be calling. I know you're busy. She starts, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. The old guilt trip preamble. I brace myself for what's next. A passive-aggressive comment about how long it's been, a mention of some holiday I missed. My grip on the phone tightens. But it doesn't come. The silence stretches again, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken things. I refuse to be the one to fill it. Finally, she takes a shaky breath, a sound that seems to travel across all 2,000 miles and all 15 years to land like a punch in my gut. And then she says the only words in the world that could ever breach my walls. Maya, we need your help. We could lose everything. Everything. The word hangs in the air, seeming to suck all the noise from the construction site into it. The whine of the saws, the shouts of the workers, the crisp Colorado air, it all vanishes. There is only that one word, that fragile, terrifying voice, and a sudden, sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. It's the feeling of a hairline crack appearing in the foundation you thought was unshakable. Dave walks over, his brow furrowed with concern. Everything okay, boss? I lower the phone, my knuckles white. I force a nod, my throat too tight to speak. But it's not okay. The past, which I had so carefully bricked up and plastered over, had just taken a sledgehammer to my front door. I didn't delegate. I didn't push it to the next day. I booked the first flight out of Denver International myself, a red-eye that cut through the darkness and spat me out into a humid Pennsylvania dawn. For 15 years, every flight I took was a step forward, toward a new contract, a bigger project, a better life. This was the first time I had ever flown backward. The air in the rental car was stale, recycled, but the moment I cracked the window, the real atmosphere flooded in. Thick, wet, smelling of damp earth and decay. You don't just breathe air like this, you wear it. It was the oppressive greenness of it all that struck me the most. The trees crowding the narrow roads, their leaves forming a canopy that choked the sunlight. Denver was all sharp angles, bright sun, and endless sky. This place was a tunnel. Every faded billboard and rust-pocked pickup truck was a ghost from a life I'd surgically removed. I felt like an anthropologist studying a lost civilization, except the artifacts were my own memories. I was a foreigner here now. I drove through the town square, past the war memorial, past the diner where I'd washed dishes for $1 an hour, and nothing had changed. That was the most shocking thing of all. The town was trapped in amber, preserved in the exact state of mediocrity I had fled. The world had moved on. I had moved on. But this place hadn't. It was waiting for me. It had always been waiting. The house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just gotten bigger. The white paint on the porch railing was surrendering, peeling back in long strips to show the gray, dead wood beneath. The lawn was a patchwork of brown grass and ambitious weeds. My father used to spend every Saturday perfecting that lawn. It wasn't just neglect, it was a testament to surrender. I cut the engine and sat for a long minute, the keys digging into my palm. What if I just turned the car around? What if I drove back to the airport, flew back to my clean, orderly life, and pretended that phone call never happened? But I couldn't. Not because of any sense of familial duty, but because of rule number 2, never leave a job unfinished. They were waiting at the door, as if they'd been watching from the window. The years had not been kind. My father, who had always seemed like a giant to me, was stooped. His shoulders caved in as if carrying an invisible weight. My mother had shrunk, the space around her filled with a nervous energy that made her seem to vibrate in place. But the real shock, the one that hit me like a physical blow, was Ethan. He stood behind them, half hidden in the dim hallway. The golden boy was gone. He was a ghost in his own skin. The effortless tan from years of being the town star athlete was gone, replaced by a pasty indoor pallor. His eyes, once impossibly blue and confident, darted around the room, never landing on anything for more than a second. He was 35, but he looked older than our father. Dinner was a master class in unspoken misery. My mother had cooked my old favorite, pot roast, but the meat was dry and the vegetables were boiled into submission. It was a meal of obligation. The silence in the room was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the scrape of forks on plates and my father's labored breathing. They asked no questions about my life in Denver, about my company, about the 15 years I had been gone. It was as if acknowledging my success would make their failure all the more glaring. I saw Ethan's hand tremble slightly as he reached for the salt. This wasn't a family. It was a collection of strangers bound by a shared disaster. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I placed my fork and knife down on the plate, the quiet clink of silver on ceramic as loud as a gunshot. I looked from my mother's downcast eyes to my father's defeated slump. I let the silence stretch for one more beat, making them feel its full weight. "Tell me," I said, my voice level, stripped of all emotion. "Tell me everything." My father cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound in the dead air. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on a water stain on the tablecloth, a faded map of some long-forgotten spill. Ethan was staring at his own hands, perfectly still on the table, as if he were afraid they might betray him. My mother twisted her napkin into a tight, pathetic rope. For a moment, I thought no one would speak, that we would just sit here until the foundations of the house rotted away. Then my father's voice, rough and low, finally broke the surface. It started with the store, he began, his words slow and heavy, each one a stone he was forced to lift. Business has been slow for years. You know how it is. The big box stores? I didn't let him finish the tired excuse. I don't know how it is, I said, my voice cutting through his preamble. My business is thriving. Get to the point. The sharpness of my tone made him flinch. He finally looked up, and in his eyes I saw the full, undiluted truth of his failure. It wasn't the economy that had broken him. It was something far closer to home. It was Ethan, he said, the name barely a whisper. He had ideas, ways to modernize, investments. He said you have to spend money to make money. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't surprise. It was the grim, ugly satisfaction of being right. I had watched them my whole life place all their bets on the golden boy, the one with the easy smile and the hollow promises. He started online, my father continued, the story now pouring out of him, a confession long overdue. Sports betting. Said it was a sure thing, a system. He was always so good with numbers. My God, the delusion. He was good at charming people, not at calculating odds. He lost. Then he chased the losses. Then came the other things. A friend with a can't-miss stock tip. A real estate deal that just needed a little capital to get off the ground. Each new failure was a nail in the coffin. To cover it, he took out a line of credit against the store's inventory, then a second mortgage on the store itself. He paused, taking a ragged breath, preparing for the final blow. When that wasn't enough, he remortgaged the house, Maya. The air left my lungs. The store was one thing, a business, an asset. But the house? This was where I grew up. This was the one thing that was supposed to be safe, the one constant in their chaotic lives. How much? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My father's eyes dropped back to the tablecloth. He couldn't say it. My mother started to weep. Quiet, desperate sobs into her shredded napkin. It was Ethan who finally spoke, his voice a raw croak. $475,000. The number landed in the center of the table and lay there, obscene and monstrous. 475,000. That wasn't a debt. It was an anchor that would pull them all to the bottom of the ocean. That was the cost of a starter home in a decent Denver suburb. It was the price of their faith in a fool. My mother finally looked at me, her face a mess of tears and desperation. We know we have no right to ask, Maya. We know that, she choked out. But you're our only chance. Please, save our home. My mother's tears were a form of currency in this house, but my bank had been closed for 15 years. Her plea for me to save our home was met with the same cold, flat silence that had dominated dinner. I looked at the three of them, a tableau of desperation, and my mind wasn't on family or forgiveness. It was on due diligence. I wouldn't invest in a failing project in Denver without a full audit, and I sure as hell wasn't going to bail out this disaster on the basis of a tearful confession. I'm not writing a check, I said, my voice cutting through the last of my mother's sobs. Not $1. Not until I see every single piece of paper. The next morning, my father led me to the store. The place smelled of sawdust and despair. He took me to his old office in the back, a room I hadn't set foot in since I was a child. It was a time capsule of failure. Stacks of invoices were held down by a dusty paperweight. The computer on the desk was an ancient beige box that probably ran on Windows 98. He gestured to a large cardboard box on the floor, overflowing with folders and loose papers. "It's all in there," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "Everything Ethan gave me." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with the wreckage. For the next 2 days, that office became my world. I worked for 48 hours straight, fueled by stale coffee from a nearby gas station and a cold, burning rage. The first day was about understanding the scale of the incompetence. The loan agreements were a predator's dream, filled with ballooning interest rates and impossible repayment schedules. The investment opportunities were so obviously scams that it was laughable. Nigerian princes would have been more subtle. It was clear that Ethan had the financial literacy of a teenager with a stolen credit card. He had been drowning, and instead of swimming for shore, he had decided to drink the ocean. I saw the progression, from the first $5,000 loss on a football game to the $50,000 investment in a company that didn't even have a website. It was a pathetic, predictable story of a fool and his family's money. But it was on the second day, when I started cross-referencing the store's handwritten ledgers with the bank statements, that the real picture emerged. And it was so much uglier than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about bad luck or stupidity. There was another layer, a deeper, darker rot. I found discrepancies everywhere. Payouts to vendors who didn't exist, inflated inventory costs, weekly cash withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time, listed under vague headings like operating expenses. It wasn't a landslide of debt. It was death by 1,000 cuts, 1,000 tiny thefts, committed day after day, week after week, for years. He hadn't just been gambling with their future. He had been systematically draining the lifeblood of their business to fund his addiction. He had been looking them in the eye every single day and lying. This wasn't a mistake. This was a long, calculated betrayal. I leaned back in the creaking chair, the room now dark save for the glow of my laptop screen. The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind something hard and pure. It was anger, yes, but a specific kind. It was the anger of a builder who has just discovered that the foundation of a house isn't just cracked, it's made of sand. I closed the last folder. The picture wasn't one of failure. It was a portrait of a thief. And I was going to have a talk with the artist. I didn't summon him to the office. That would have been a mercy. I waited for him in the living room, the heart of the home he had betrayed. I cleared the coffee table of my mother's old magazines and porcelain figurines, creating a sterile corporate surface. I laid out 3 folders, spaced evenly apart like exhibits in a trial. One for the gambling debts, one for the fraudulent loans, and one for the theft. When he walked in, he looked like an employee on his way to a termination meeting. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He couldn't meet my eyes. He saw the folders, and a flicker of something, fear, maybe even relief, crossed his face. The waiting was over. "Look, Maya, I know what this looks like," he started, his voice a low, rehearsed murmur. "I messed up. I got in over my head. The economy here is brutal. It's not like Denver. People aren't spending. I was just trying to generate some capital to keep us afloat." I let him talk. It was important to let a subject lay out their entire false narrative before you dismantle it piece by piece. It leaves them with nowhere to retreat. I let the silence hang in the air after he finished his pathetic little speech. I just stared at him, my expression blank, until he started to fidget. He was waiting for me to yell, to cry, to do something emotional. I would do none of those things. I tapped the first folder. "The economy didn't force you to bet $20,000 on a single football game, Ethan. That was you." He flinched. I pushed the second folder towards him. "And the economy didn't sign Dad's name on a loan application for $100,000 with an 18% interest rate. That was also you." His face went from pale to chalky. He was cornered, but the real knockout punch was still on the table. "But this," I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold register as I slid the third folder across the table. "This is my favorite part." I had printed out the bank statements from the store's account, highlighting the weekly cash withdrawals. 2,000 here, 3,000 there, always on a Friday. "You weren't trying to keep them afloat," I said, the words sharp and precise. "You were siphoning cash from the register every single week. You were stealing from them. You looked them in the face every night at the dinner table after spending their retirement money on God knows what." I paused, letting the accusation sink into the silence of the room. "You didn't just lose, Ethan. You lied. You lied to them every single day." For a moment, he just stood there, his mouth slightly open, the last of his defenses crumbling into dust. Then, something inside him snapped. The cornered animal finally decided to bite. "Lied!" he exploded, his voice cracking with a sudden shocking fury. What was I supposed to do? Huh? Tell them their precious store was a sinking ship? Tell them their golden boy was a failure? He took a step towards me, his hands now clenched into fists. "You have no idea. You have no idea what it was like." His voice rose to a shout, raw with a bitterness that had been festering for 15 years. "You got to escape. You packed your little bag and ran away to your perfect, successful life while I was stuck here. I was the one who had to stay, to help them, to carry this whole damn thing on my back. Don't you dare talk to me about lying. You think any of this was easy for me? It was always easy for you, Maya. It was always easy for you." The words hung in the air between us, ugly and final. And in that moment, I understood. This was never about the money. Not really. This was his reckoning. And it had been coming for a very long time. Ethan's shout echoed in the house long after he stormed out, slamming the back door behind him. The sound rattled a plate on a high shelf. Then, silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, charged quiet that follows a detonation when you're still waiting to see what collapsed. My parents hadn't moved from the kitchen doorway. They had heard everything. Their faces were a mixture of fear and something else. Something I recognized all too well. Calculation. The direct assault had failed. Now it was time for the siege. My mother was the first to move. She drifted into the living room, not looking at me, and began to aimlessly straighten things that were already straight. A pillow on the couch, a framed photo of Ethan holding a baseball trophy. "I didn't sleep for a year after you left, you know," she said to the wall, her voice soft and laced with a carefully curated tremor. "Every night I would lie awake and wonder if you were safe, if you were eating, if you had a warm coat." It was a classic maneuver, a tactical deployment of weaponized nostalgia. It had nothing to do with the $475,000 of stolen money. It was about shifting the foundation of the argument. The problem wasn't the crisis of today. It was my original sin of 15 years ago. My father's turn. He walked over to the window and stared out at the neglected lawn. "We might have made mistakes, Maya," he said, his voice a low rumble of false reason. "Lord knows we weren't perfect parents, but we are a family. That's the one thing we always tried to be." He turned to face me, his eyes full of a weary, manufactured sorrow. "And a family doesn't abandon its own in a time of trouble. A family." He said the word like it was a sacred text, a magical incantation that was supposed to absolve all sins. They weren't defending Ethan directly. They were too smart for that. They knew his actions were indefensible. Instead, they were attacking me, my character, my decision to build a life for myself. This was the game they had always played. Ethan was the sun around which their entire universe revolved. My role was to be the responsible, distant moon, and my one job was to reflect his light and never, ever cast a shadow on him. By leaving, I had broken the rules of their solar system. Now they were trying to pull me back into orbit with the gravity of guilt. They weren't just asking me to pay off a debt. They were asking me to validate every bad decision they had ever made, to affirm that their blind faith in their failed son was not a tragic mistake, but a noble, familial virtue. They were asking me to agree that his weakness was a tragedy, while my strength was a betrayal. I looked from my mother's trembling lip to my father's righteous stare, and I saw the full, breathtaking scope of their moral bankruptcy. They weren't asking for a bailout. They were demanding a sacrifice. I couldn't breathe in that living room. Their guilt was a vapor, odorless and toxic, and it was filling my lungs. I needed to escape. Without a word, I turned and walked up the stairs to my old bedroom. The door creaked on its hinges, a sound I hadn't heard in 15 years. The room was a shrine to a girl I barely remembered, a ghost who used to live in this house. The walls were still the same pale lilac, now faded and water-stained in one corner. A poster of a long-forgotten band was tacked to the wall, its corners curled and yellowed. My high school diploma was still in its cheap frame on the dresser. It was like a museum exhibit, adolescent female, circa early 2000s. I ran a finger across a dusty bookshelf, leaving a clean streak in the grime. This wasn't my room anymore. It was a crime scene. I didn't know what I was looking for. A distraction, maybe. A single object that wasn't saturated with the misery of the last 72 hours. My eyes landed on a dusty cardboard box sticking out from under the bed. I dragged it out, the sound scraping against the wooden floor. It was filled with the detritus of a former life. Yearbooks, old photographs, a bundle of letters from a high school boyfriend whose face I could no longer recall. And at the bottom, tucked away like a secret, were two spiral-bound notebooks with faded covers. My diaries. A cold knot of apprehension formed in my stomach. What could be worse than digging up the angst-ridden ramblings of a 17-year-old? But something compelled me. I needed to remember who I was before I became the woman who could write a check for $500,000. The first few dozen pages were exactly what I expected. Dramatic complaints about curfews, whining about my parents' blatant favoritism toward Ethan, sketches of a future in a city far, far away from here. It was the diary of a prisoner planning an escape. Then I turned a page and landed in the spring of my senior year. The tone shifted. The entries became shorter, more confused. There was a week of blank pages and then a single frantic entry. Ethan's in real trouble. The bad kind. No one will tell me anything. Reading the words, a fog began to lift in my mind, revealing the edges of a memory I hadn't accessed in over a decade. It was like finding a locked door in a house you thought you knew perfectly. I kept reading, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. Hushed phone calls all night. Mom crying in the kitchen. Dad sold the bass boat today. He said he just got tired of it, but he loves that boat. The bass boat. He had saved for 3 years for that boat. And then it was just gone. And then the final piece, written in a shaky, uncertain hand. Mr. Henderson came over again tonight. He told them to stop talking to me about it. They said it was to protect Ethan's future. The name, Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, was the key that unlocked the door. The memory didn't just come back. It crashed into me. The late-night call. The sickening lurch of fear. Ethan, stumbling through the door, reeking of whiskey and terror, his face cut and bleeding. The car, his graduation present, was a mangled wreck. He had been drunk. He had hit another car. There were injuries. And then, nothing. It was all erased. My parents took control. They hid Ethan away. They spoke in whispers. They made phone calls. And they paid. They paid a fortune to the other family to make it all disappear, to keep the police out of it, to scrub the entire incident from existence so the Golden Boy's brilliant future wouldn't be tarnished by a DUI and a vehicular assault charge. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The money. Where did that money come from? And then I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as granite, my college fund. The money they had been saving for me since I was a child. The money that had mysteriously been lost in the market a few months before my graduation, forcing me to get a second job and apply for every scholarship I could find. They hadn't just saved him. They had sacrificed me. This wasn't a single crisis. This was their business model. My fingers felt numb as I pulled out my phone and searched for a name. I found it. Arthur Henderson, attorney at law, retired. He answered on the third ring, his voice reedy and old. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the seismic shock I was feeling. "This is Maya Cole. I'm calling about a service you provided for my family 17 years ago, regarding my brother, Ethan." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That was a long time ago, Maya," he said finally, his voice cautious. "It was a private family matter." I leaned forward, the old diary resting on my knees. Was it a family matter when my college fund was used as hush money? "I'm not a teenager anymore, Mr. Henderson. I'm just an investor trying to understand a pattern of risk." He sighed, a long, weary sound of defeat. "Your parents," he said slowly, "did what they felt they had to do to protect their son." The confirmation settled over me, not with a sense of anger, but with a terrifying, absolute clarity. My parents weren't victims. They were the architects of this entire disaster. And the debt they owed wasn't just to the bank. It was to me. And I was here to collect. I walked back down the stairs, but I was not the same person who had walked up them an hour before. The anger was gone, burned away. The old, familiar sting of resentment had vanished. In their place was a clarity so profound it felt like ice in my veins. The diaries, the phone call, they hadn't just given me information, they had given me a new blueprint. I was no longer operating from the old plans of the dutiful daughter or the estranged child. I was a demolition expert who had just found the building's hidden structural flaw. The entire edifice of their family dynamic, the guilt, the obligation, the endless sacrifices for Ethan, was built on a lie I was never meant to discover. And I was about to bring the whole thing down. They were in the kitchen, huddled together over lukewarm cups of coffee, plotting their next emotional salvo. They looked up as I entered, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope. They were expecting tears, recriminations, perhaps a grudging capitulation. They were prepared for a family drama. What they were not prepared for was a hostile takeover. I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway, my posture straight, my hands clasped calmly behind my back. I had left the box of evidence, the loan agreements, the fraudulent ledgers, the old diaries upstairs. I didn't need them anymore. The truth was now a part of me. "I've made a decision," I announced, my voice devoid of the emotion they were expecting. It was the same voice I used with subcontractors who tried to cut corners. "I've reviewed the situation and I see a path forward." A wave of relief washed over my mother's face. My father straightened up, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. They thought they had won. They thought the guilt had finally done its work. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about miscalculating leverage. They had come to me as a daughter. I was about to respond as a creditor. "I will help," I said, and my mother let out a small sob of relief, reaching for my father's hand. I let the word hang in the air for a beat, letting them savor their imagined victory before I delivered the rest of the sentence. "But not in the way you think." I took a step into the room, and the dynamic shifted. I was no longer the defendant in their court of emotional appeals. I was the judge. I was the one holding the gavel. This isn't a gift. This isn't a bailout. This is a business transaction. There will be no blank checks and no tearful reunions. There will be conditions. Strict, non-negotiable conditions. My father's face hardened, the brief flicker of gratitude replaced by confusion, then suspicion. He was beginning to understand that the rules of the game had just fundamentally changed. He was no longer dealing with the girl who fled in the night. He was dealing with the woman she had been forced to become. The first call I made wasn't to my lawyer in Denver. It was to a name I found online. A sharp, hungry-looking local attorney whose office was a 10-minute drive from the house. I needed someone who understood the landscape, someone who wasn't tied to my family's history. I met him in his small, tidy office the next morning and laid out the broad strokes. I didn't tell him about the theft or the old car accident. I didn't need to. I simply framed it as a high-risk intrafamily loan requiring ironclad security. He understood immediately. He was a businessman. By the afternoon, he had drafted a preliminary contract. It was perfect. It was a fortress built of paper and ink. That evening, I gathered them in the living room again. This time, I didn't clear the coffee table. I let it remain cluttered with their life, a backdrop for the sterile legal document I placed in the center of it. Ethan was there, sullen and silent, brought back into the fold by some parental command. I looked at each of them in turn, letting them feel the weight of my gaze. I told you there would be conditions, I began, my voice calm and measured. I am now going to outline those conditions. They are not a starting point for a negotiation. They are the deal. The only deal. I opened the folder and took out the contract, its crisp, laser-printed pages a stark contrast to the chaos of their lives. Condition number 1, I said, my eyes locking on my father. I will pay the full amount of the debt directly to the creditors. In exchange, the deed to this house and the title for the store will be transferred into my name. They will remain my property, my assets, until 100% of the principal has been repaid to me. You will, in effect, be my tenants. My mother made a small, wounded sound like a stepped-on animal. The idea of not owning their own home was a blow to the very core of their identity. I didn't pause. Condition number 2. My gaze shifted to Ethan. You will, within the next 7 days, enroll in Gamblers Anonymous and provide me with proof of attendance at your weekly meetings. You will also find a job. Any job. I don't care if you're flipping burgers or sweeping floors. And you will arrange for 50% of your gross salary to be directly deposited into an account I control. Every single paycheck. Ethan's face went crimson. You want me to what? You want to humiliate me? I want you to pay your debt, I countered, my voice like ice. That's what people do when they owe someone nearly $500,000. They work. I turned my attention back to my parents, who were staring at the document as if it were a venomous snake. And condition number 3. For the two of you. You will cease all financial support for Ethan, effective immediately. No cash, no paying his bills, nothing. Furthermore, the 3 of you will begin attending family therapy sessions. I have already researched a qualified therapist. I will attend via video conference when I am back in Denver. It's a condition of the loan. The silence that followed was absolute. I had systematically taken apart their entire world, every toxic dynamic, every enabling behavior, and replaced it with a set of cold, hard rules. I had restructured their family like a failing company. This is insane, my father finally stammered. This is cruel. My mother was just shaking her head, tears silently streaming down her face. I folded my hands on the table. What's cruel is what you have allowed to happen for the last 17 years. What's cruel is stealing a person's college fund to cover up a drunk driving accident. This isn't cruelty. This is the consequence. You have 24 hours to decide. If you agree, you'll sign these papers in my lawyer's office tomorrow afternoon. If you refuse, I will be on a plane back to Denver in the morning, and you can deal with the bank on your own. The 24 hours I gave them was a war conducted in silence. The air in the house was thick with unspoken accusations. I could hear them in their room, the low murmur of my father's voice, and the sharp weeping cadence of my mother's. They were not discussing the terms of the contract. They were mourning the loss of their power over me. I sat in the living room, my laptop open, arranging the wire transfer that would either save them or be canceled in the morning. I was a stranger in their house, a foreign occupying force. Every time I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, the conversation would cease, and they would look at me with the eyes of the betrayed. They truly could not comprehend that their emotional currency was no longer legal tender. Ethan was the one who finally broke. He cornered me as I was coming down the stairs, his face blotchy and his eyes wild with a desperate, pathetic rage. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he spat, his voice a harsh whisper. "You love seeing us like this. After all these years, this is your revenge, turning us into your employees, your charity case." I looked at him, at this hollowed-out man who was once the golden child of my world, and I felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, not even satisfaction. "This isn't revenge, Ethan. This is arithmetic. You created a deficit. I'm providing a solution. These are the terms of the loan. Don't mistake them for feelings." My coldness seemed to infuriate him more than any shout could have. He wanted a fight, an emotional explosion that would put us back on familiar ground. I refused to give it to him. The final hours were the worst. My mother tried one last time, approaching me with a plate of toast I hadn't asked for, her face a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern. "Maya, honey," she said, her voice trembling just so. "We're your family. Can't you just help us? Without all these papers? Without the lawyers?" She was asking me to step back into the role they had created for me, to be the one who fixes things quietly, who absorbs the damage and asks for nothing in return. "No," I said simply, pushing the plate away. "I can't." That was when the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, cheerful chime that was utterly at odds with the funereal atmosphere in the house. For a moment, no one moved. Then my father, with a look of dread, went to answer it. A man in a cheap suit stood on the porch, holding a clipboard. He wasn't a salesman. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "I'm from the bank. I'm here to deliver the preliminary notice of foreclosure. The eviction proceedings will begin in 30 days. The words, spoken so calmly, did what all the tears and shouting could not. They made it real. The monster was no longer under the bed. It was standing on the front porch with a clipboard and a court order. The color drained from my father's face. My mother let out a tiny, choked gasp. Reality had finally arrived, and it was wearing a polyester tie. The lawyer's office was a symphony in beige and quiet competence. We sat around a large mahogany table, the 5 of us, me, the lawyer, and the 3 people whose lives I was about to purchase. The lawyer explained the documents in a calm monotone, his voice stripping away all the emotion and leaving only the brutal legal facts of the transaction. Transfer of deed, power of attorney over the business assets, wage garnishment agreement. It was all there, in black and white. When he pushed the papers toward them, my father picked up the pen first, his hand moving slowly, as if through water. He signed his name, the name he had built a life around, and in that moment, he signed away his kingdom. My mother was next, her hand shaking so badly that her signature was a barely legible scrawl. A single tear fell from her eye and landed on the paper, making the fresh ink bleed slightly. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stared at the pen for a long, silent moment. I could see the war in his eyes, the final, desperate struggle of his pride against the crushing weight of his failure. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. Then he snatched the pen and signed his name with a vicious, angry slash. As the last document was signed and notarized, I transferred $475,000 from my world into theirs. A life's work for him. A few clicks of a button for me. But as I watched the confirmation appear on my phone, I felt no thrill of victory. There was no sweet taste of revenge. There was only the immense, soul-crushing weight of what I had just done. I hadn't just bought a house. I had bought them. The power I had just seized wasn't a prize, it was a life sentence. The signing of the papers wasn't an end, it was the start of the job. For the next 7 days, I did not live in my childhood home as a daughter who had returned. I occupied it like a consultant brought in to oversee a corporate restructuring. The emotional chaos of the previous days was replaced by the clean, orderly progression of a project plan. I had a checklist in my head, a series of action items to be completed before my departure. This was my new role. I was no longer the runaway. I was the receiver, appointed by the court of my own making. My first task was the store. I went there with my father the next morning, but not to offer condolences. "We need a full inventory," I said, handing him a clipboard. "Everything, down to the last box of nails. I need to know the exact value of the assets before I decide on the best liquidation strategy." He flinched at the word liquidation, but he took the clipboard. For 2 days, we worked in the dusty silence of the failing business. This was my world, the world of numbers and stock and value. For him, it was a mausoleum. He would pick up an old tool, a specific brand of wood stain, and I could see him drifting into a memory. I would cut through it without mercy. "How many units, Dad? What's the wholesale cost?" This wasn't an inventory, it was an autopsy, and I refused to let sentimentality contaminate the report. On the 3rd day, I had to deal with Ethan. He was scheduled for his first Gamblers Anonymous meeting at 7 p.m. in a church basement across town. He didn't come out of his room until I knocked on the door and said, "It's time to go." The drive was 5 miles of the loudest silence I have ever experienced. He stared out the passenger window, his face a grim mask. He looked like a man being driven to his own sentencing. I wasn't his sister in that car. I was his parole officer. I pulled up in front of the church, the last of the evening light filtering through the trees. He made no move to get out. "This is a joke," he muttered. "It's not going to fix anything." I put the car in park and looked at him. Not with sympathy, but with the flat, emotionless gaze of a superior. "It's not supposed to fix anything," I said. "It's a contractual obligation. The meeting starts in 5 minutes. Your next one is on Thursday. I'll get a confirmation call if you're not there." He finally opened the door and slunk away without looking back. The therapy was the final item on the checklist. I sat my parents down at the kitchen table with my laptop, a list of pre-vetted family therapists on the screen. My mother looked at the names as if they were poison. "Talk to a stranger about our lives?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Maya, some things should stay in the family." I clicked on the profile of a woman with a kind face and 20 years of experience. "That's no longer an option," I said, pulling out my credit card to book the initial consultation. "Your inability to talk honestly is a direct line item in the $475,000 liability I just absorbed. This is risk management." I booked the appointment. I paid for the first month. I set up the video link for my own remote participation. I was not healing my family. I was protecting my investment. Each action I took that week was a brick in a new wall, not between me and them, but between who they were and who they had to become to satisfy the terms of my contract. I was not their daughter anymore. I was their bottom line. The airport terminal was a decontamination chamber. The air, filtered and impersonal, smelled of floor wax and jet fuel, a clean, sterile scent that scrubbed the memory of damp earth and decay from my lungs. I sat at the gate, a stranger among strangers, and for the first time in a week, I felt my shoulders begin to unclench. This was my world, a world of schedules, destinations, and transactions, with no emotional subtext. My work here was done. The contracts were signed, the money was transferred, the systems were in place. I had done exactly what I came to do. My flight was boarding in 20 minutes. I pulled out my phone, a reflexive, meaningless gesture. My inbox was full of emails from my life in Denver, updates from my foreman, blueprints from an architect, a new contract proposal. I scrolled past them all, my thumb hovering over my call log and text messages. The screen was blank. There was no, "have a safe flight," no thank you. Not even a final, angry outburst. The silence was not an oversight. It was an answer. It was the clear, ringing confirmation that our relationship was now exactly what I had designed it to be, a business arrangement. They had received the funds. The transaction was complete. There was nothing more to say. For 15 years, a part of me had carried a low-grade, persistent guilt. Had I been selfish to leave? Had I abandoned them? I had built my entire life as a fortress against that feeling, constructing walls of success and independence so high that the whispers from the past couldn't get over them. Now, sitting in the hard plastic chair, waiting for my flight to be called, I realized the truth. The weight I had been carrying wasn't the price of my freedom. It was the anchor of their dysfunction, a chain they had wrapped around my ankle the day I was born. And by leaving, I hadn't abandoned them. I had simply refused to drown with them. Now boarding, Flight 1138 to Denver. The announcement cut through the terminal's low hum. I stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I walked down the jet bridge without looking back. On the plane, I found my window seat and pressed my forehead against the cool plexiglass. The engines whined, building to a roar that vibrated through the fuselage, through my seat, through my bones. As the plane accelerated down the runway, pinning me back against the seat, I didn't feel a sense of loss. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a strange and powerful lightness. The wheels left the tarmac, and something inside me left with them. The 15-year-old runaway was finally, truly gone. Looking down, I saw the patchwork of green fields and small, sad houses shrink until they were nothing more than a pattern on the earth below. I realized I hadn't saved my old family. That family was built on a foundation of lies, and it was meant to crumble. What I had done was far harder. I had forced them to face the truth. I had given them a blueprint for a new, more honest structure, whether they chose to build it or not. The price was their love, or at least the suffocating performance of it. But the reward was myself. I had finally closed the most painful chapter of my life, not as a fugitive, but as the one who wrote the ending. And I had written it on my own terms. 2 years. In Denver, 2 years is long enough to see a skyline change, to watch a steel skeleton rise from a patch of dirt and become a glass-skinned tower glinting in the sun. My own company has doubled in that time. We're not just restoring old buildings anymore. We're creating new ones. My life is a blueprint, executed with precision. The rules I built for myself at 18 have proven to be as strong as any foundation I've ever poured. My life works. It is clean, profitable, and mine. The past is a different country, one I have no plans to visit again. But it still sends mail. On the 1st of every month, an alert dings on my phone, a direct deposit from a garage in central Pennsylvania. It's never late. I don't look at the name attached to the transfer, only the number. It's a line item in my accounts receivable, a debt being slowly, methodically repaid. And every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time, I log into a video call. On the other side of the screen are my parents, sitting on the familiar couch in the house that is legally mine. A therapist, a calm woman named Dr. Evans, guides the conversation. Our talks are not warm. They are tense, often awkward, filled with the long pauses of people learning a new and difficult language. But in 2 years, not a single lie has been spoken between us. It is the most honest relationship we have ever had. The house is safe. I get a report once a month from a property manager I hired to make sure the lawn is mowed and the gutters are clean. It is an asset on my balance sheet, a piece of real estate in my portfolio. It is also a reminder, a silent 4-bedroom monument to the price of truth. I have paid the property taxes on it for the last 2 years. I consider it a maintenance fee. I had not expected anything more. The contract was the end of the story, I thought. The slow repayment, the stilted therapy sessions, that was the epilogue. I was wrong. The real ending arrived on a Tuesday, in a thin, cheap envelope mixed in with blueprints and invoices. The mail was on my desk. I saw it immediately because it was the only piece that was personal, addressed by hand in a blocky, unfamiliar script. There was no return address. My first thought was that it was from a creditor, some loose end of Ethan's old life that had finally tracked him to me. I almost threw it away. But curiosity, a ghost of some former self, made me pick it up. I slid it open with a letter opener. Inside was a single folded piece of notepaper. It wasn't a letter. It was a note. There was no "Dear Maya," no long explanation, no plea for forgiveness. There were only 2 words, written in that same careful, almost childish hand. Thank you. Sorry. I stared at the paper for a long time, the hum of my office fading into the background. I read the 2 words over and over again. They were so small, so simple. Yet they held the weight of 2 decades of lies and resentment. There was no joy in that moment. The ice that had formed in my veins 2 years ago did not melt, but something shifted. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible sound of a lock clicking open, a door I didn't even know was still barred. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope. The debt was still on the books. The house was still in my name. The past was not erased. But for the first time, it felt complete. My reckoning hadn't been revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about cauterizing a wound. It was the only possible cure.